On November 30th, 1939, the tactical stability of Northern Europe collapsed. The Red Army of the Soviet Union launched a massive artillery barrage across the Karelian Isthmus, signaling the start of the Winter War. The strategic mathematics of the invasion were terrifyingly lopsided. The Soviet Union had a population of 170 million people. Finland had a population of 3 million. The Soviets invaded with 21 divisions, consisting of 450,000 men, 2,500 tanks, and 3,800 aircraft. The Finnish army had no tanks. They had virtually no anti-tank guns. They had ammunition supplies that were calculated to last for only 2 weeks. Based on every conventional military calculation, Finland should have ceased to exist as a sovereign nation within 10 days. The Soviet objective was simple: crush the Finnish defense lines with overwhelming volume of fire and march to Helsinki. The Soviet commanders, emboldened by their sheer numbers, expected a parade. They did not expect the terrain. Finland is a labyrinth of dense forests and frozen lakes, a landscape that neutralizes the advantage of heavy armor. More importantly, they did not account for the temperature. The winter of 1939 was one of the coldest on record. In the Kala region, the mercury dropped to -40 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, the mechanics of war change fundamental properties. Standard gun oil freezes, jamming automatic weapons. Steel becomes brittle and can shatter under stress. The air becomes so dense that sound travels differently. Truck engines seize. Batteries die. The Soviet troops, mostly conscripts drafted from the warmer regions of Ukraine and southern Russia, were woefully unprepared for this environment. They lacked winter camouflage. They wore dark brown uniforms that stood out against the blinding white snow like targets on a shooting range. They gathered around bonfires to stay warm, making themselves beacons for artillery. They were an army of numbers fighting against an army of ghosts. And the deadliest of these ghosts was a 5'3" tall farmer named Simo Häyhä. Simo Häyhä was 33 years old when the first Soviet tanks crossed the border. He lived in the small village of WWII. He was not a career soldier in the traditional sense. He was a member of the Finnish Civil Guard, a volunteer militia, but his real profession was survival. He was a moose hunter. In the brutal Scandinavian wilderness, hunting is not a sport. It is a discipline of patience and precision. Simo had spent his entire life learning how to move through the forest without breaking a twig. He learned how to track an animal for days without being seen. He learned how to judge distance by the way the light hit the trees. When the invasion began, Simo took his own rifle down from the wall. It was not a modern high-tech weapon. It was a Finnish variant of the Russian Mosin Nagant, known as the M2830. This was a rugged, bolt-action rifle fed by 5-round stripper clips, firing the 7.62 by 5.3 millimeter rimmed cartridge. It was a weapon Simo knew intimately. He had modified it himself. He had filed down the sights to fit his eye perfectly. He had adjusted the trigger pull so that it broke cleanly, like a glass rod. In Civil Guard competitions, Simo was capable of hitting a target 150 meters away 16 times in 1 minute. That is one accurate shot every 3.75 seconds, using a bolt-action rifle, in the snow. Most snipers in 1939 relied on optical technology to engage targets. The standard-issue sniper rifle was equipped with a telescopic scope, usually with 3 or 4 times magnification. These scopes allowed a shooter to see the enemy's face from 800 meters away. They were considered essential for modern warfare. But when Simo reported for duty with the 6th Company of Infantry Regiment 34, he made a decision that baffled his commanding officers. He refused to use a scope. He insisted on using the rifle's standard iron sights. To the average soldier, this seemed like a disadvantage. Iron sights require the shooter to align a metal post at the end of the barrel with a rear notch. It requires perfect vision and instinct. It limits the effective range. But Simo's decision was based on a deep, almost scientific understanding of optical physics and survival tactics in a sub-zero environment. Simo argued that a telescopic scope was a death trap. First, there was the issue of silhouette. To look through a scope, a sniper must raise his head an extra 2 to 3 inches above the rifle stock. In a sniper duel, 2 inches is the difference between a miss and a cranial impact. By using iron sights, Simo could keep his head pressed tight against the stock, presenting the smallest possible target to the enemy. He could bury his face in the snow, leaving only the top of his helmet and his eyes visible. Second, there was the physics of light. Even in the dim winter sun of the Arctic Circle, a glass lens reflects light. A glint of sunlight bouncing off a sniper's scope acts like a mirror, sending a flash of light across the battlefield. This flash can be seen by an enemy spotter from miles away. It is an instant giveaway. Iron sights are matte metal. They do not reflect. They do not shine. They are invisible. Third, and perhaps most critically, was the issue of thermodynamics. In -40-degree weather, the human body is a heat source. If a sniper breathes on a cold glass lens, it fogs up instantly. If the rifle is brought from the freezing outdoors into a warm dugout and then back out again, condensation forms and freezes, rendering the scope useless. Iron sights do not fog. They do not freeze. They work as long as the shooter's eyes work. Simo Häyhä did not trust glass. He trusted steel and his own biology. Simo's daily routine on the Kala front was a masterclass in calculated lethality. He would leave the finish lines before dawn, while the world was still pitch black. He carried a day's supply of dry bread and sugar cubes in his pockets. He wore heavy wool layers covered by a rough, white snow camouflage cape. He moved into the no-man's land between the armies. He did not pick a spot at random. He selected his killing zones based on the predicted movement of the Soviet patrols. Once he found a position, often a snowbank or the root system of a frozen tree, he began to engineer his environment. He did not just lie down in the snow. He modified it. The muzzle blast of a high-powered rifle creates a massive shockwave of expanding gas. If the snow in front of the barrel is loose, this shockwave kicks up a cloud of white powder. This snow puff is a dead giveaway. It points a giant arrow directly to the sniper's location. To prevent this, Simo would pack the snow down hard in front of his rifle barrel. He would pour water on it if he had to, turning it into a sheet of ice. This hard surface would not disperse when he fired. The shot would remain smokeless and dustless. He also utilized a biological trick to remain invisible. In the freezing air, human breath creates a visible cloud of steam. A sniper breathing heavily can be spotted from hundreds of yards away. The vapor cloud rises like smoke from a chimney. To prevent this, Simo kept a mouthful of snow in his mouth while he was waiting for a target. The thermodynamics were simple. The snow cooled the air inside his mouth. When he exhaled, his breath was the same temperature as the outside air. No steam, no cloud, no visual signature. He would lie in these positions for hours, sometimes an entire day, completely motionless. He entered a state of hibernation. He slowed his heart rate. He ignored the pain of the cold. He waited for the Soviet army to make a mistake, and the Soviet army made many mistakes. The Soviet tactics at the Battle of Kala were based on mass and volume. They sent waves of infantry across the frozen river, supported by heavy artillery. They assumed that the Finnish defenders would be overwhelmed by the sheer number of targets, but Simo turned the forest into a nightmare for the Red Army. He targeted the officers first. He knew that the Soviet conscripts were poorly trained and relied heavily on rigid leadership. If the officer died, the unit became paralyzed. His first confirmed kills began in early December. The reports from the front line were clinical and terrifying. A Soviet political commissar, identifiable by his leather coat, stepped out of a bunker to give orders. He was 300 meters away. A single shot rang out from the forest. The commissar fell face down in the snow. No muzzle flash was seen. No position was identified. The Soviet soldiers fired blindly into the trees, but there was nothing there. An hour later, a Soviet sniper tried to locate the shooter. He scanned the tree line with his binoculars. Simo, lying frozen in a snowdrift, saw the movement. He aligned his iron sights. He accounted for the slight crosswind. He fired. The bullet struck the Soviet sniper, killing him instantly. By the second week of December, the kill count began to rise mathematically. 10 kills, 20 kills, 30. The Soviet troops began to panic. They realized that there was a predator in the woods. This was not random artillery fire. This was a specific targeted elimination of key personnel. They began to call him Belaya Smert, the White Death. The psychological impact was devastating. Soviet patrols refused to enter certain sectors of the forest. Artillery crews were afraid to man their guns because Simo was picking them off through the viewing slits of their gun shields. The Soviet commanders became obsessed with killing this one man. They realized that Simo Häyhä was worth a battalion of regular soldiers. They began to deploy specific countermeasures. They sent out their own snipers. They saturated the grid squares with mortar fire. But they were fighting a man who had become part of the landscape. Simo was not just hiding in the snow. He was the snow. As December progressed, the war intensified. The days grew shorter, providing only a few hours of twilight for Simo to operate. But he used the darkness too. He knew the terrain better than the Soviets knew their own supply lines. He began to take bolder risks. He moved closer to the enemy lines, sometimes within 100 meters. At this range, his iron sights were deadlier than any scope. He could acquire targets instantly. He could shoot and move before the sound of the shot even reached the enemy bunker. The legend of the White Death was growing. But so was the danger. The laws of probability state that if you engage in combat every day against an army of 500,000 men, eventually, the math will turn against you. The Red Army was preparing a massive counter-sniper operation. They were bringing in their best marksmen from Leningrad. They were determined to hunt down the ghost of Kala. Simo Häyhä was about to enter the deadliest phase of the Winter War, where he would face not just conscripts, but professional killers who knew exactly who they were looking for. By mid-December 1939, the tactical situation in the Kala sector had transformed from a conventional military engagement into a psychological nightmare for the Soviet invaders. The Red Army had crossed the border expecting to fight a disorganized militia. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a freezing labyrinth where death arrived without sound and without warning. The morale of the Soviet 139th Rifle Division was collapsing. The soldiers in the front lines were no longer afraid of a Finnish army. They were afraid of a single man. The reports filtering back to the Soviet High Command were frantic and superstitious. Officers were being eliminated with impossible precision. A platoon commander would step out of his tent to smoke a cigarette and drop dead a second later. A machine gunner would look through his viewing slit and take a bullet through the eye. There was no muzzle flash to target. There was no sound to triangulate. The forest simply swallowed the bullets and the shooter. The Soviet troops began to whisper a name in the trenches. Belaya Smert, the White Death. This name was not just a moniker. It was a diagnosis of their reality. The fear of Simo Häyhä became so pervasive that it began to dictate Soviet tactical doctrine. Artillery batteries were ordered to fire random barrages into empty quadrants of the forest, simply because a sentry thought he saw a snowbank move. Thousands of rounds of ammunition were wasted firing blindly into the trees. Soviet patrols refused to advance into no man's land unless they were supported by tanks. The fear of one man was paralyzing the advance of an entire division. The Soviet political commissars, responsible for maintaining discipline and ideological purity, realized that the situation was critical. They could not allow a Finnish farmer to humiliate the Red Army. They decided to escalate the engagement. They sent a request to the Leningrad military district for a specialized solution. They did not ask for more tanks or more artillery. They asked for hunters. In the third week of December, a team of elite Soviet snipers arrived at the Kala front. These were not conscripts. They were professional marksmen, trained in the art of counter-sniping. They were equipped with the finest version of the Mosin Nagant rifle, the model 1891 30 PU. Unlike Simo's iron-sighted weapon, these rifles were fitted with 3.5 power optical scopes. These optics were state-of-the-art, precision ground lenses that allowed the shooter to identify a target's heartbeat from 600 meters away. The leader of this Soviet team was a highly decorated sniper who had already claimed dozens of kills. His name has been lost to history, but his mission was recorded in the unit logs: eliminate the White Death. The strategy was simple. The Soviet team would use themselves as bait. They would set up in concealed positions, waiting for Simo to fire. Once Simo revealed his position by taking a shot, the Soviet team would use their superior optics to spot him and kill him from a range where his iron sights were ineffective. It was a trap designed around the technological advantage of the telescopic scope. Simo Häyhä was aware of their arrival. A sniper develops a sixth sense for the battlefield. He noticed the change in the enemy's behavior. The random fire stopped. The careless exposure of officers ceased. The forest became quiet. This silence was the signature of a professional hunter. Simo knew he was being hunted, and he accepted the challenge. He understood that this was no longer a battle of attrition. It was a duel. For several days, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out across the frozen river. Simo changed his tactics. He moved only at night. He stopped firing at easy targets. He knew that if he shot a common soldier, the muzzle report would give away his position to the Soviet aces waiting in the distance. He had to be patient. He had to wait for the hunters to make a mistake. The duel reached its climax on a clear, freezing afternoon in late December. The temperature was minus 20 degrees Celsius. The sky was a pale, icy blue. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long, stretching shadows across the snow. This low angle of light is critical to understanding the physics of what happened next. In the Arctic winter, the sun does not rise high. It skims the tree line, creating a unique optical environment where reflections are amplified. The Soviet sniper had positioned himself well. He was hiding in a dense thicket of spruce trees, approximately 400 meters from the Finnish lines. He had a clear field of fire. He had been waiting for 6 hours, motionless, scanning the Finnish trenches with his scope. He was disciplined. He was patient. But he was relying on a piece of technology that had a fatal flaw. Simo was positioned in a snowbank to the east. He was buried up to his shoulders. He had the sun behind him. He was scanning the forest not with a scope, but with his naked eyes. The human eye has a wider field of view than any scope. It detects motion and contrast better than a lens. Simo was looking for anything that broke the natural pattern of the forest. At 1400 hours, the Soviet sniper made a microscopic error. Perhaps he shifted his weight to relieve a cramp. Perhaps he raised his head slightly to get a better angle on a suspected target. Whatever the reason, he moved his rifle. As the barrel shifted, the angle of the sun hit the front lens of his telescopic sight. For a fraction of a second, a glint of light flashed in the dark forest. It was not a steady beam. It was a pulse, a brief reflection of the sun bouncing off the curved glass. To an untrained observer, it would have looked like a piece of ice catching the light. But Simo Häyhä was not an untrained observer. He was a hunter who knew that glass does not grow on trees. That single flash of light provided Simo with a complete firing solution. He instantly calculated the distance, 400 meters. He estimated the windage. There was a slight breeze from the north. He knew the elevation required for his iron sights. He did not hesitate. He did not wait for a better view. He knew that the glint meant the enemy was looking right at him. Simo aligned the front post of his iron sights with the center of the flash. He exhaled, ensuring his breath was cooled by the snow in his mouth. He squeezed the trigger. The trigger broke cleanly. The firing pin struck the primer. The 7.62mm bullet left the barrel at a velocity of 800 meters per second. The physics of the shot were gruesome. The bullet crossed the 400-meter gap in 0.5 seconds. The Soviet sniper, looking through his scope, never heard the shot. The bullet traveled faster than the speed of sound. It struck the Soviet sniper exactly where Simo had aimed, directly in the center of the optical lens. When a high-velocity projectile strikes a glass lens, it does not shatter it like a window. It punches through, carrying fragments of glass and steel with it. The bullet traveled down the tube of the scope, acting as a guide rail, and entered the Soviet sniper's eye socket. It was a kill shot of geometric perfection. The hunter who relied on optics had been killed by the reflection of his own technology. The Soviet sniper collapsed. The rest of the counter-sniper team, realizing their leader was dead, panicked. They opened fire on the general area where they thought the shot came from, but Simo was already gone. He had utilized the recoil of the rifle to slide backward into his dugout, disappearing into the trenches before the casing even hit the snow. The death of the elite Soviet sniper sent a shockwave through the Red Army. They had sent their best man, armed with the best technology, to kill a peasant with a bolt-action rifle. And the peasant had won. The message was clear. There was no safety in the woods. There was no distance that was safe. If you could see the White Death, he could see you. And if he could see you, you were already dead. This victory elevated Simo from a soldier to a myth. The Finnish troops began to believe he was invincible. They claimed he had magic in his eyes, but Simo knew the truth. It wasn't magic. It was physics. It was discipline. And it was the fatal arrogance of relying on a scope in a land where the sun is a weapon. But the war was far from over. The Soviets, infuriated by the loss of their ace, decided to change tactics again. If they could not kill him with a bullet, they would kill him with volume. They began to mass their infantry for human wave attacks. The duel in the shadows was over. The slaughter was about to begin. The Battle of Kala was entering its bloodiest phase, and Simo Häyhä was about to trade his patience for a submachine gun. The Christmas of 1939 would be red. By late December 1939, the Winter War had descended into a level of brutality that defied the comprehension of the outside world. The Kala River front was no longer a tactical line on a map. It was a meat grinder. The Soviet High Command, furious at the lack of progress, ordered the 56th Rifle Division to break the Finnish line at any cost. They abandoned sophisticated maneuvering. They reverted to the tactic of the sledgehammer. They poured thousands of men across the frozen river in human wave attacks, supported by direct fire from T-26 tanks. The Finnish defenders were outnumbered 10-1. They were running low on ammunition. They were exhausted, but they were held together by a single, unyielding phrase that became the motto of the entire war. Kala kestie, Kala holds. It was not just a slogan, it was a statement of physical law. The Finns had decided that the Red Army would not pass. And standing at the center of this defiance was Corporal Simo Häyhä. The week leading up to Christmas 1939 marked the peak of Simo's lethal efficiency. The Soviets were no longer sending small patrols, they were sending battalions. For a sniper, this presented a target-rich environment, but it also presented a problem of physics. A sniper rifle is a precision instrument designed for a slow rate of fire. It is not a machine gun, but Simo was forced to use it like one. On December 21, 1939, the winter solstice, the darkest day of the year, the Soviet army launched a massive frontal assault. The sun rose for only a few hours, casting a twilight gloom over the battlefield. Simo took up a position on the flank of the Soviet advance. He was using his iron-sighted Mosin Nagant. As the Soviet infantry surged forward, Simo began to fire. One shot, one kill. He worked the bolt with the rhythm of a machine. He did not panic. He did not rush. He simply acquired a target, exhaled, and pulled the trigger. On that single day, official Finnish reports credit Simo Häyhä with 25 confirmed kills. That is more than 1 kill per hour of daylight. It is a statistic that borders on the impossible. But achieving this number required Simo to battle the thermodynamics of his own weapon. When a high-powered rifle is fired repeatedly, the friction of the bullet traveling down the barrel generates immense heat. The steel barrel expands. As it heats up, two things happen. First, the heat creates a mirage, a shimmering wave of hot air that rises off the barrel and distorts the shooter's view of the target. Second, the metal warps microscopically, shifting the point of impact. A hot rifle is an inaccurate rifle. Simo could not afford inaccuracy, but he also could not stop firing. He developed a field-expedient solution to the laws of thermodynamics. Between shots, he would scoop up handfuls of snow and pack them onto the barrel of his rifle. The snow hissed and melted on contact with the hot steel, absorbing the thermal energy and cooling the weapon. This was a dangerous tactic. If the water seeped into the action and froze, the rifle would jam. If the temperature change was too sudden, the steel could crack. But Simo knew exactly how much snow to apply. He kept his weapon cool enough to maintain zero, allowing him to continue his harvest of the enemy. By the end of the day on December 21st, Simo's shoulder was bruised black and blue from the recoil of hundreds of rounds. His ears were ringing, but he had single-handedly broken the momentum of a Soviet company. The psychological impact of 25 men dropping dead from invisible fire was greater than the physical loss. The Soviet advance faltered. Kala held. But Simo Häyhä was not a one-dimensional warrior. While the world remembers him as a sniper with a bolt-action rifle, the Soviet troops feared him just as much for what he did when they got close. The forests of Kala were dense, with visibility often reduced to 20 meters. In this claustrophobic terrain, a long bolt-action rifle is a liability. It is slow to cycle and difficult to swing. When the Soviet patrols pushed deep into the Finnish lines, trying to outflank the sniper positions, Simo would leave his Mosin Nagant in the dugout. He would pick up a weapon that was the complete antithesis of a sniper rifle. The Suomi KP-31 submachine gun. The Suomi KP-31 was a marvel of Finnish engineering. It was heavy, machined from solid steel. It fired the 9x19mm parabellum round at a cyclic rate of 900 rounds per minute. It was fed by a 71-round drum magazine. In the hands of a novice, it was a spray and pray weapon. In the hands of Simo Häyhä, it was a surgical saw. Simo treated the submachine gun with the same precision as his rifle. He did not just hold the trigger down. He fired in short, controlled bursts. BRRT. 2 or 3 rounds at a time. He knew that the first round hit the target and the recoil pulled the second and third rounds slightly upward. He used this recoil to stitch bullets up the torso of the enemy. One particular engagement in late December illustrates his mastery of close-quarters combat. A Soviet ski patrol consisting of 12 men managed to infiltrate the woods behind Simo's position. They were hunting him. They moved silently on skis, dressed in white camouflage, believing they had the element of surprise. Simo heard the swish of their skis on the snow. He did not retreat. He moved to an ambush position behind a dense thicket of pine. He waited. He let the lead scout pass. He let the second man pass. He waited until the entire squad was in the kill zone. Then he opened fire with the Suomi. The physics of the engagement were devastating. At a range of 15 meters, the 9mm bullets hit with massive kinetic energy. The 71-round drum allowed Simo to engage multiple targets without reloading. He swept the line of Soviet skiers. Within 5 seconds, the patrol was annihilated. The silence of the forest returned, broken only by the smell of cordite and the sound of the hot submachine gun casing cooling in the snow. The Finnish High Command estimated that Simo killed over 200 enemy soldiers with his submachine gun, in addition to the 500 killed with his rifle. This brings his total combat kills to over 700. This number is difficult to verify, but the Soviet reaction suggests it was accurate. They stopped sending small patrols into Simo's sector. They realized that sending men into the woods to find him was simply a complicated way of committing suicide. As Christmas Eve approached, the fighting at Kala reached a fever pitch. The Soviets were desperate to secure a victory before the end of the year. They launched night attacks, using searchlights to illuminate the forest. Simo shot out the searchlights. They tried to use armored sleds to protect their infantry. Simo shot the drivers through the viewing slits. On Christmas Day, 1939, there was no truce. The Red Army fired thousands of artillery shells into the Finnish lines. Simo sat in his dugout, eating his ration of dry bread and cleaning his rifle. He was tired. His face was burned by the frost, but his resolve was unbroken. He wrote in his diary that he felt no hate for the enemy, only a professional duty to protect his land. The Soviets, however, hated him. They hated him with a passion that bordered on obsession. The White Death had become a demon in their collective consciousness. He was the reason they couldn't sleep. He was the reason they couldn't light a fire. He was the reason they were freezing to death in a foreign land. The failure of the Christmas offensive broke the spirit of the Soviet commanders. They realized that brute force and human wave attacks were not working against a man who understood the physics of the forest better than they understood the mechanics of their own tanks. They decided to change their strategy. If they could not kill him with infantry, and they could not kill him with snipers, they would try to kill him with geology. They would churn the earth itself until there was nowhere left to hide. January 1940 would bring a new kind of hell to the Kala front. The Soviets were bringing up massive 203 mm howitzers. They were going to try to erase the grid square that Simo Häyhä occupied. The sniper duel was over. The war of annihilation was about to begin. Simo was about to learn that even a ghost can bleed if you drop enough high explosives on him. January 1940 arrived not with a bang, but with a silence so deep it felt heavy. The temperature in the Karelian wilderness plummeted to -40 degrees Celsius. At this extreme, the war became a secondary struggle. The primary struggle was against thermodynamics. The human body burns calories at a furious rate just to maintain a core temperature of 37 degrees. If a soldier stops moving for too long, his blood thickens. If he touches bare metal, his skin bonds to it instantly. Frostbite turns fingers black and gangrenous within minutes of exposure. For the Soviet troops of the 56th Division, January was a death sentence. Their supply lines were stretched thin. Their field kitchens were freezing solid before the food could be served. They were dying in their sleep, huddled together in dugouts that offered no protection from the biting wind. But for Simo Häyhä, the cold was not an enemy. It was an ally. Simo had lived his entire life in this environment. He understood the biophysics of the freeze. He dressed in layers of wool, trapping pockets of warm air against his skin. He kept his circulation moving by flexing his muscles isometrically while lying still in the snow. He ate high-calorie rations of sugar and fat to fuel his internal furnace. While the Soviet conscripts were shivering uncontrollably, destroying their aim and giving away their positions with the noise of their chattering teeth, Simo lay completely still, his body temperature regulated, his heart rate slow and steady. The Soviet High Command, however, had realized that the cold was not going to kill Simo Häyhä, and their snipers couldn't find him. So, in January 1940, they changed their tactical doctrine entirely. They stopped trying to fight a war of precision. They began to fight a war of probability. The new strategy was called blind fire. The Soviet commanders calculated that if they fired enough bullets into a specific grid square of the forest, statistically, one of them had to hit the White Death. They deployed heavy machine gun companies armed with Maxim guns. These water-cooled weapons could fire continuously for hours. The Soviet gunners were ordered to sweep the forest line back and forth, cutting down trees, shredding the underbrush, and saturating the air with lead. Imagine the physics of this assault. Thousands of 7.62 millimeter rounds flying through the woods at supersonic speeds. They splintered the pine trees, turning the wood into deadly shrapnel. They churned up the snow, destroying the cover. For Simo, the battlefield transformed from a hunting ground into a chaotic zone of random death. He could no longer rely solely on concealment. He had to rely on intuition. Simo learned to read the rhythm of the blind fire. He noticed that the Soviet gunners followed patterns. They would sweep left to right. They would pause to reload. They would focus on areas that looked like good hiding spots. Simo used this against them. He stopped hiding in the good spots. He began to hide in the open, in shallow depressions where no sniper should be. He hid in the areas the machine gunners ignored because they looked too exposed. By doing the illogical, he remained invisible. But the Soviets did not stop at machine guns. They brought up the heavy artillery. The 122 millimeter and 152 millimeter howitzers began a campaign of terrain modification. They were not aiming at Simo. They were aiming at the forest itself. Their goal was to remove the geography that protected him. The artillery barrages of January 1940 were intense. The ground shook for hours at a time. The overpressure from the explosions could rupture internal organs even if the shrapnel missed. On one particularly violent afternoon, the law of averages nearly caught up with Simo. He was positioned behind a small ridge, observing a Soviet supply route. The artillery fire was walking toward his position. Explosions were erupting 50 meters away, then 40, then 30. Simo pressed himself flat into the snow, making himself two-dimensional. A heavy mortar shell landed just 10 meters behind him. The blast wave lifted him slightly off the ground. The heat of the explosion scorched the air. Metal shrapnel, jagged pieces of cast iron traveling at thousands of feet per second, tore through the air. One large piece of shrapnel slammed into the back of Simo's heavy winter coat. It shredded the thick wool. It tore through the layers of cotton underneath. But miraculously, it did not penetrate his skin. The energy of the fragment was absorbed by the padding of his suit. Most soldiers, after surviving a near miss of that magnitude, would retreat. They would be shaken. They would suffer from shell shock. Simo Häyhä simply reached around, felt the tear in his coat, and checked his rifle. The scope, or rather the iron sights, were still aligned. The action was still clear. He brushed the snow off his back and resumed his watch. To him, the artillery was just another environmental hazard, like a blizzard or a falling tree. It was not something to be feared. It was something to be endured. This reaction highlights the unique psychological state of Simo Häyhä. Interviews conducted years later reveal a man who completely compartmentalized the act of killing. He did not view the Winter War as a glorious crusade. He did not view the Russians as monsters. He viewed the war through the lens of a professional hunter. In the mind of a hunter, there is no malice toward the prey. A moose does not hate the hunter. The hunter does not hate the moose. It is a relationship defined by skill and necessity. Simo applied this same logic to the Soviet soldiers. When he looked down the barrel of his Mosin Nagant, he did not see a man with a family. He saw a target silhouette. He saw windage. He saw elevation. He saw a problem to be solved with physics. This detachment was his armor. Many snipers suffer from profound psychological trauma because they see the faces of the men they kill. They watch them fall. They watch the life leave their eyes. But Simo possessed a mental discipline that shielded him from the horror. He famously stated, "I did what I was told to do as well as I could." This was not an excuse, it was a statement of fact. He was a tool of the Finnish state, functioning with the reliability of a machine. By late January, the Soviet morale had hit rock bottom. The blind fire tactics were consuming millions of rounds of ammunition with zero confirmed results. The artillery had turned the Kala forest into a wasteland of cratered snow, but the White Death was still broadcasting his presence with a single shot every few hours. The Soviet soldiers began to believe he was a spirit. They told stories around their campfires that bullets passed through him. They said he could vanish into thin air. But Simo was flesh and blood, and the strain was beginning to show. He was losing weight. His face was gaunt, burned by the wind and the frost. He was suffering from chronic sleep deprivation. The Finnish lines were thinly manned, meaning Simo could rarely leave his post. He would sleep in short naps, sitting up in his dugout with his rifle across his knees. He was fueled by sugar cubes and a stubborn refusal to yield. The Finnish High Command recognized that Simo was becoming exhausted. They offered him leave. They offered to pull him off the line for a week of rest in the rear. Simo refused. He knew that the Soviet pressure was increasing. He knew that every day he wasn't in the forest was a day the Russians could advance a few more meters. He stayed. As January turned to February, the war shifted again. The Soviets were done playing games. They had massed an overwhelming force for a final push. They were bringing up armored sleds, flamethrower tanks, and fresh divisions from the east. The era of the lone hunter was ending. The era of total war was beginning. Simo Häyhä had survived the snipers. He had survived the cold. He had survived the artillery. But the mathematics of the battlefield were relentless. No man can dodge the rain forever. The bullet that would end his war was already being manufactured in a Soviet factory, destined for the chamber of a rifle in the Ulisma forest. The legend of the White Death was about to face its bloody conclusion. By February 1940, the Winter War had shifted from a border skirmish into a desperate war of attrition. The Soviet Red Army, embarrassed by their failure to crush the small Finnish defense force, poured massive reinforcements into the Kala sector. The tactical objective was simple: destroy the Finnish morale by destroying their symbol of resistance, Simo Häyhä. The Soviets deployed heavy artillery battalions specifically tasked with grid saturation. They did not aim for specific targets. They aimed for grid squares. They fired thousands of high-explosive shells into the forest, turning the frozen landscape into a moonscape of craters and splintered timber. The mathematics of survival in this environment were shrinking. The Finnish defenders were reaching their breaking point. They had been fighting without relief for 3 months. Ammunition was low. Food was scarce. Men were falling asleep at their posts from sheer exhaustion. Simo Häyhä was no exception. He had lost nearly 20 pounds. His uniform was tattered and stained with gun oil and soot, but he remained on the line. He understood that his presence was the only thing holding the morale of the 6th Company together. As long as the White Death was watching the woods, the men believed they could hold. But the Soviet pressure was relentless. In mid-February, the Red Army launched a new offensive. They stopped trying to outsmart Simo. Instead, they decided to overwhelm him. They sent waves of tanks and infantry against the weary Finnish lines. The fighting shifted from long-range sniping to brutal close-quarters combat. Simo was forced to abandon his sniper rifle more frequently, relying instead on his Suomi submachine gun to repel the Soviet assaults. On March 6, 1940, the war reached its violent crescendo in the forests of Ulisma. The Soviet 128th Infantry Division launched a massive dawn attack. They were supported by heavy mortar fire and T-26 tanks. The Finnish defenses crumbled under the weight of the assault. The order came down to counterattack. It was a desperate move. The Finns were outnumbered 50-1. At 0800 hours, Simo Häyhä was in the thick of the fighting. He was moving through the swampy forest on skis, his submachine gun in hand. The air was thick with smoke and the deafening roar of combat. Simo was operating on pure adrenaline. He was flanking a Soviet platoon that was pinning down his unit. He moved from tree to tree, firing short, controlled bursts. He killed 40 Russian soldiers that morning. He was a whirlwind of violence, trying to stem the tide of the Red Army single-handedly. But at 0900 hours, the laws of probability finally turned against him. A Soviet soldier, hidden in the brush, spotted the white camouflage of the Finnish legend. He raised his rifle. He did not fire a standard lead bullet. He fired an explosive incendiary round designed to detonate on impact. The shot was fired from close range. Simo turned just as the trigger was pulled. The bullet struck him in the lower left jaw. The physics of the impact were catastrophic. A standard bullet punches a hole. An explosive bullet destroys structure. The round detonated upon hitting the mandible bone. The force of the explosion shattered his jaw into fragments. It tore off his left cheek. It destroyed his dental arch. The shockwave of the blast knocked him backward into the snow. He lay there unconscious, his blood turning the white snow crimson. The battle raged over his fallen body. For several minutes, Simo Häyhä lay in the no-man's land, bleeding out into the ice. The extreme cold, which had been his ally for months, now played a critical role in his survival. The -40-degree temperature caused his blood vessels to constrict rapidly. The blood freezing on his wound acted as a makeshift tourniquet, slowing the hemorrhage. If it had been a summer war, he would have bled to death in minutes. Eventually, the Finnish forces managed to push the Soviets back just enough to recover their wounded. A fellow soldier found Simo lying in the drift. The sight was horrific. The soldier later reported that half of Simo's face was missing. The damage was so extensive that they assumed he was dead. In the chaos of the retreat, there was no time for a pulse check. They loaded his body onto a supply sled, stacking him on top of a pile of corpses destined for the rear. For miles, Simo Häyhä rode on a sled of the dead, bouncing over the frozen ruts of the forest road. He was comatose, hovering in the gray zone between life and death. When the sled arrived at the field aid station, the orderlies began to unload the bodies to prepare them for burial. They grabbed Simo by the arms and legs to toss him onto the snow. But then a sharp-eyed medic noticed something. As they moved the body, Simo's leg twitched. It was a faint, involuntary muscle spasm, but it was enough. The medic rushed over and checked for a pulse. It was weak, thready, but it was there. He shouted for a stretcher. The White Death was not dead. Simo was rushed into emergency surgery. The field surgeons were appalled by the injury. They had to reconstruct his jaw using bone taken from his hip. They wired his shattered face back together. He remained in a deep coma, his body fighting to repair the massive trauma. While Simo slept, the war came to an end. The Finnish army, having exhausted every bullet and every ounce of strength, could no longer hold the line. On March 12, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. Finland was forced to cede 10% of its territory to the Soviet Union, including Simo's home village of WWII. The border was redrawn. The war was over. On March 13, 1940, the day the guns finally fell silent across Finland, Simo Häyhä opened his eyes. He woke up in a hospital bed, his head wrapped in bandages, his face swollen and ruined. He woke up to a world at peace. The timing was almost poetic. The man who had defined the war woke up the moment it ended. He had survived 505 confirmed kills. He had survived the artillery. He had survived the cold. And he had survived a bullet to the face. But the Simo Häyhä who woke up was different. He was permanently disfigured. He would never smile the same way again. He faced years of painful surgeries and a long recovery, but he was alive. The Soviet Union had thrown an entire army at him. They had fired millions of shells. They had sent their best killers, and they had failed. Simo Häyhä had beaten the odds. He had beaten the math. On the morning of March 13, 1940, a strange silence fell over the forests of Finland. For 105 days, the air had been filled with the thunder of artillery, the scream of mortars, and the crack of rifle fire. But at 1100 hours, the guns stopped. The Moscow peace treaty had gone into effect. The Winter War was over. Finland had lost 10% of its land mass, but it had preserved its independence. The Soviet Union had lost over 126,000 men trying to conquer a nation of farmers. At almost the exact moment the ceasefire began, in a hospital bed in Jyväskylä, Simo Häyhä opened his eyes. He had been in a coma for a week. He woke up to a world that had fundamentally changed. He was alive, but the cost of survival was immediately apparent. The explosive bullet had shattered his jaw and removed half of his left cheek. He could not speak. He could barely breathe. The pain was absolute, but as the fog of unconsciousness lifted, he realized he was no longer fighting. The irony of his awakening was cruel. The land he had fought to protect, the village of WWII where he was born and raised, was now on the wrong side of the new border. It had been ceded to the Soviet Union. Simo Häyhä, the hero of the Winter War, woke up homeless. He had saved his country, but he had lost his home. The years following the war were a different kind of battle for Simo. It was not a battle against the Red Army, but against physical trauma. The damage to his face was catastrophic. He underwent 26 separate surgeries to reconstruct his jaw. The surgeons took bone from his hip to rebuild his mandible. They grafted skin to cover the gaping wound. The procedures were painful and exhausting, stretching over several years. For a long time, he could only eat liquid food. His speech was permanently impaired. Despite the disfigurement, Simo did not hide from the world. In the years after the war, he became a symbol of Finnish resilience. He was awarded the Cross of Liberty and the Medal of Liberty. He was promoted from corporal to second lieutenant by Field Marshal Mannerheim, a jump in rank that was unprecedented in Finnish military history. But Simo did not care about the medals. He cared about returning to the quiet life he had lost. Once his recovery was stable, Simo was given a small farm in Ruokalahti, a quiet municipality in southeastern Finland. He built a new house. He returned to the forests, not as a soldier but as a hunter. He became a renowned breeder of Karelian bear dogs, a breed known for its courage and hunting instinct. He spent his days in the woods tracking moose, surrounded by the silence he loved. His skills with a rifle had not diminished. Even with his depth perception altered and his face reconstructed, he remained a crack shot. On one occasion, the president of Finland, Urho Kekkonen, invited Simo to go moose hunting. As they walked through the snow, a moose appeared in the distance. The president turned to Simo, expecting him to take a careful, measured aim. Simo simply raised his rifle and fired in a single fluid motion. The moose dropped instantly. The president was stunned. It was a reminder that the old man with the scarred face was still the deadliest hunter in the North. Throughout the decades, journalists and historians sought him out. They wanted to know the secret. They wanted to understand the mindset of a man who could kill 500 people. They expected a complex philosophical answer. They expected him to talk about hatred or nationalism or the horrors of war. In 1998, just a few years before his death, an interviewer asked him the question that everyone wanted answered. "Simo, how did you become such a good shooter?" Simo looked at the interviewer. He did not smile. He did not boast. He replied with a single word. Practice. That one word encapsulated his entire philosophy. There was no magic. There was no divine intervention. It was simply the result of doing the same thing over and over again until it became instinct. When asked if he regretted killing so many Soviet soldiers, he gave an answer that was equally pragmatic. "I only did what I was told to do as well as I could." This was not an evasion of moral responsibility. It was the truth of a soldier. Simo did not hate the Russians he killed. To him, they were targets sent by a government to invade his home. His job was to remove the targets. He viewed his role in the war with the same detached logic as clearing a field of stones or hunting a pack of wolves. It was a necessary task for survival. Simo Häyhä lived a long, quiet life. He never married. He lived alone on his farm, surrounded by his dogs and his trophies. He was a man of the earth, humble and unassuming. If you passed him on the street in his later years, you would see a small, frail old man with a cane and a scarred face. You would never guess that you were looking at the most efficient sniper in the history of warfare. Simo Häyhä died on April 1st, 2002. He was 96 years old. He passed away peacefully in a nursing home for war veterans in Hämeenä. He died of old age, the one thing that no soldier in 1939 thought he would ever reach. His legacy is written in the numbers. 505 confirmed kills with a bolt-action rifle, over 200 kills with a submachine gun, a total of over 700 enemy soldiers eliminated in fewer than 100 days. These numbers are statistically terrifying. Modern snipers, equipped with laser rangefinders, ballistic computers, and satellite imagery, struggle to achieve a fraction of that count in wars that last for years. Simo did it with iron sights in -40-degree weather while eating dry bread and snow. He proved that technology does not win wars. The spirit wins wars. The Soviet Union had the tanks, the planes, and the optics. Finland had Simo. And in the dark, frozen forests of Kala, Simo was enough. He taught the world a lesson in the physics of survival. You do not need a scope to see the enemy. You only need the will to pull the trigger. He was the White Death. And in the archives of military history, there will never be another one like him. If you want to uncover more stories about the men and machines that defied the laws of war, make sure to subscribe to this channel. The history books are full of shadows, and we intend to explore them all. See you in the next mission.